on here? Yes. Good evening. I'm Robert, thank you. I'm Robert Prezant, Dean of the College of Science and Mathematics here at Montclair State University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Fall 2006 Margaret and Herman Sokol Science Lecture. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to spend a moment reminding everyone that this lecture series exists only because of the long-standing commitment of two of our very, very special graduates of the class of 1937 and 1938. Margaret and Herman Sokol met here at Montclair State University and started their lives together here. Herman, of course, some of you might know, went on to a very distinguished career in pharmaceutical chemistry, rising to the presidency of Bristol-Myers before Squibb interjected, and along the way, co-discovering that fairly important antibiotic tetracycline. Margaret taught math and science in New Jersey public schools for a number of years and traveled extensively. Herman passed away many years ago, but Margaret kept her very close ties and relationships with her alma mater, and has been a very good friend of our institution, supporting not just this lecture series, but an array of student and faculty research programs, graduate programs, travel programs, and also our very first endowed chair. Unfortunately, Margaret also passed away in early June of this year, having reached her 90th year. She will indeed be sorely missed, but her kindness and foresight will allow this excellent lecture series to continue for many years into the future. Now tonight, we are exceptionally pleased to have Mr. Nicholas Wade here to present our Sokol Science Lecture. Nicholas, a resident of Montclair, by the way, was born in Aylesbury, England, and was educated at Eton College in Cambridge, where he graduated with a degree in biochemistry. A look in his early years, however, showed that he had no interest in becoming a scientist or even a science writer, though he was always interested in writing. While personally, I had my interest in science stimulated by wading around in a pond in New York, collecting every frog I could possibly get my hands on, Nicholas, when recently asked what first got him interested in science at all, said it was Greek iambics. It's something that, from that laugh, must ring true with many of you. Nicholas offered this rationale. Being forced to write iambics as the major focus of his education for 5 years gave him the idea of studying something entirely different. Always interested in science and writing, he embarked on a path that would blend the two. Upon completing his studies at Eton, he took a job publishing at a publishing company and then moved on to one of the two most prestigious and important science journals in the world, the weekly journal Nature, rising to the role of deputy editor of that journal in the London office, and eventually becoming their Washington correspondent. A few years later, he was presented with the opportunity to join the other preeminent science weekly, the journal Science, in their Washington office as a reporter, and as he put it, he thought it would be fun to work with an American company. That relationship lasted about a decade. He joined the New York Times in 1981 as an editorial writer to cover science, technology, and medicine. After writing editorials for 10 years, he became science editor. However, during all that time, even though he found the work intriguing, he also found it to be somewhat limited. He thought it deprived the writer of bylines as well as the time or ability to research, investigate, or be creative in their writing. So he went back to reporting, and we're glad he did, now specializing in reporting on biological research, and he does this with remarkable creativity and a proclivity that is abundantly obvious. He writes on anything that is biological news, particularly groundbreaking research in genetics and molecular biology. His science articles have run the gamut, and you've probably read some of his work. Work that include articles on anthrax, on the brain, on genetic coding, cancer research, even on cat evolution. Mr. Wade has also edited a number of Science Times books. These are books that I know adorn many of your bookshelves, including the Times Book of the Brain, the New York Times Book of Language and Linguistics, and the Times Book of Genetics. Remarkably, he's also authored an array of books, such as The Ultimate Experience, Man-Made Evolution, A World Beyond Healing, The Prologue and Aftermath of Nuclear War, and Betrayers of the Truth, A Study of Fraud in Science. And in 2005, while on leave from the New York Times, he wrote the very well-received and rather controversial Before the Dawn, Recovering the Lost History of Our Ancestors. This being an account of the human race's evolution over the last 50,000 years, and it is this, his latest book, that will form the basis of his lecture tonight. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Mr. Nicholas Wade.
Thank you very much for that kind of introduction. I'm going to take my jacket off if you don't object. So I'm going to try and get through 50,000 years of human history in 15 minutes or less, so we may be going a little fast, but not too fast, I hope. And I'm going to try and tell you this story in terms of what we have been discovering from genetics. The human genome is a new, maybe quite unexpected source of information about the deep human past. And it forms a thread to weave together the information we have from all the traditional disciplines, and in particular to look on a very obscure but very important period of our history, which is our evolution in the last 50,000 years. So I'd like to start with our family tree as an evolutionary biologist would see it. Here are our cousins, the great apes, the chimpanzees, the orangutans who left Africa many years before, so not part of our story. There are the gorillas, and there are the bonobos. The chimpanzees are the sort of archetypal fruit-eating forest ape. And whenever a new ecosystem opened up for them, they exploited it and became a different species. So about 7.5 million years ago, when there was an opportunity to feed just on grass and vegetation, no fruit, they entered that niche and became gorillas. And about 3.5 million years ago, when there was an opportunity to eat both fruit and grass in the absence of gorillas, they became bonobos. But what we're interested in is, about 5 million years ago, there was a climate change. Africa became much drier, the forests fragmented into woodland and open grassland, and the chimpanzees came down to exploit that niche, and that started the line that led to modern humans. So these pre-humans, these pre-humans began this transition, this metamorphosis from chimps to humans. And I'd like you to look first at the left-hand column. It's easy to think of the physical changes and then the behavioral changes. So the physical changes, first we come down from the trees. We still use the trees as a refuge, so we're still very chimp-like. It's not for another 2.5 million years that our brains start to get bigger than the chimps. Chimps' brains are about a third the size of ours. About 1.7 million years ago, we made the first transition to a creature that we might probably recognize as human. This is Homo ergaster, the paleoanthropologists call it. Homo ergaster has short arms, meaning it can no longer live in the trees. It's lost its primate fur and has bare skin. And it has a very proud new possession, a nose, which probably came about because it helps conserve moisture in the hot savannas it is now occupying. And then the next milestone is 100,000 years ago, when we have anatomically modern humans. Those are humans whose skeleton and skull looks just like ours, but their behavior was very much more primitive, so far as we can tell. And then 50,000 years ago, we have what archaeologists call behaviorally modern humans. That means people whose behavior, as far as we can tell, is no different from that of hunter-gatherer societies who live today. But in fact, it's quite different from our behavior. Now, if you look at the stone tools, these are the best guide we have to human behavior. At 2.5 million years ago, I'm sorry you have to read some of this sideways, you can see a very primitive set of stone tools being used. And it's used for a very long period, from 2.5 to 1.7 million years ago, as if our behavior is unchanging, is very concerning. Then from 1.75 to 50,000 years ago, those two panels in the middle are really the same tool set. You see the second tool set called the Acheulean, and this too is very conservative and unchanging. Then suddenly, 50,000 years ago, you see this burst of innovation, and you see a whole suite of modern tools. I'm sorry they identified sideways, but at the top, that little thing with a point on is for sort of boring holes. Then there's a chopper, and then down toward the bottom there are two bone needles for sewing clothes, presumably, and they're the first object of art, the little figurine and the bone pendants. So the people who lived 50,000 years ago were much closer to us than all the others. And it's very important to understand what it was that made the difference, that caused this sort of flowering of creativity. And the best guess we have right now is there was some cognitive change, some change in the neural circuits of the brain that gave them a new ability. Now, nothing is more important for a social animal than language. And we know from a gene that's been discovered in a London family that has a very subtle speech defect called a gene called FOXP2, that FOXP2 evolved to its present form very recently, in the last 50,000 years or so, a little more. So it looks like language was the final component of our behavior that was needed to make us modern, or people at least very similar to us. So this ancestral human population that existed in Africa, it was confined to Africa, is the last population from which everyone in the world descended. And it would be very nice to know as much about it as we could, and unfortunately, we know very little. But here is a summary of what I think we can infer. Now, this is based on essentially two sources. It's based on the idea that there's a universal people. If you abstracted all the behaviors that anthropologists have found in common to be possessed by all societies in the world, that would be that set of universal behaviors is what you can infer must have existed in Africa before the dispersal. And the other source of information is how hunter-gatherer peoples live today. Oh, and the third, of course, is genetics. So genetics tells you that this population was at one time very small. It had dwindled down to as few as 5,000 people. They lived as hunter-gatherers. Their social structure was very egalitarian. They had no leaders, no chieftains, and no authority. And that might sound a recipe for chaos and anarchy, and it probably would have been, but for the fact that religion probably evolved along with language, which I think is a reasonable assumption because religion is about sharing concepts, and concepts are shared by language. So religion was probably the main constraint on people's behavior, and was in effect the early substitute for the institutions of law and government that emerged in later societies. These people probably had boats, but they had no bow and arrows. I'll tell you how we know that later. They lived in small fractious groups, essentially extended families, which tended to split apart when numbers got too large, probably about 150 or so. They were highly territorial. They defended their own territory against their neighbors, and they were probably much more aggressive than we are. But nonetheless, they had this instinct for trading and exchange, and so they would trade goods and also marriage partners with their neighbors, even though they also warfare with them a lot. And in short, they possessed in embryo form the social institutions of war, warfare, religion, and trade, which characterize today's society. Now, politics was important back then as now. So here is the geopolitical situation that existed 50,000 years ago. Most of the world outside Africa was dominated by archaic species of humans who had left Africa many hundreds of thousands of years previously. So in Southeast Asia, there was Homo erectus. The Homo erectus never reached Australia. And in Europe, there were the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were much more heavily muscled than modern humans. They were probably very frightening to our ancestors. And if you look at that map, you can see that they blocked the exit from Africa to Europe. So for hundreds of thousands of years, they penned in the modern human population, which is that little grey lozenge in northeast Africa, if you can see that. That is the sort of guess as to where the ancestral population of modern humans lived. So how did our ancestors escape? Well, because of the development of language, around about this time, their population started to expand, both within Africa, and at last they made an escape. And this is the route they took. Now, one of the most remarkable things about this exodus is that we can tell from the genetics that only one group of people escaped. Only one tiny group. Now, we don't know why, but presumably the odds of getting out were very unfavorable, and only one group made it. So it's from this little group that was probably a tribal band of 150 people. The whole of the rest of the world outside Africa was populated. So we think they went along the coastline of Southeast Asia. You have to remember, we were a tropical species at this stage. And also the world was still in the grip of the Pleistocene Ice Age, which ended only 10,000 years ago. So if you're a tropical species and going north is not only blocked by the Neanderthals, but also pretty cold, it seems reasonable you would go east as far as you could. Now, there is, it's only when you have to cross the gap, or I should say, because the shading around the edges of this map reflect the fact that during the last ice age, so much water was caught up in the glaciers, and sea level was about 200 feet lower. So the margins of the continents were much wider than today. And so those shadings show the coastline of 50,000 years ago. And it's only in the gap between Sunda, which is encompasses present-day Indonesia, and Sokol, which Australia was then joined to New Guinea in the north and Tasmania in the south. It's only at the Sunda-Sahul gap you get an open sea, about 60 miles. And since our ancestors clearly crossed it, they must have had boats, which were presumably the way they crossed from the southern tip of the Red Sea at the beginning of their journey. So having made this sea voyage, they then started spreading into the inland and presumably encountering the archaic species who occupied it. We have no evidence of what happened to Homo erectus, but Homo erectus sites do vanish around 50,000 years ago, as our ancestors presumably went inland by the rivers, by the major rivers, and populated the interior. And one branch of them, who reached India, would then have also doubled back and gone to Europe. We'll get to them later. So I'd like to explain briefly how we know, how we can track by genetics the migrations of people around the world. So it's a curious fact of biology that all men in the world carry the same Y chromosome. The Y chromosome, unlike the other chromosomes, does not exchange genetic material with its partner, the X, because one cannot risk allowing the male determinant gene on the Y to sneak into the X chromosome. That would be chaos. So the Y chromosome is the one bit of the nuclear genome that is inherited unchanged from father to son. And so everyone has a single chromosome. You can think of it as Adam's chromosome, if you like. But of course, in the ancestral human population, there would have been at least 2,500 Adams. But just by the luck of the draw, you can see that in each generation, some men are going to have no daughters, and some will have no children, and their Y chromosome will not be passed on. So in a small population with no one coming in from outside, sooner or later, and the sooner the smaller the population is, one Y chromosome will be universal. So that's why all men are brothers and they have the same Y chromosome. But it's also the case that as time goes on, mutations build up on the Y. And if you imagine a sort of population of men moving slowly from A to B to C, and mutations sort of regularly striking, and the population is also sort of diverging, you can see that there'll be sort of branch points at which some descendants have the mutation and others don't. So if you analyze the mutations on the Y chromosome in men from different places, you find they all fit on a big genealogical tree of the Y chromosomes. So that men in the A and B lineages are found in Africa. Everyone outside Africa carries the mutation known as 168. And other mutations appear at particular sort of bottlenecks, like going from Siberia into the Americas. And the same is true with the only other bit of the genome which is inherited unchanged, which is the mitochondrial DNA, the little circles of DNA that exist in the cell outside of the nucleus. And these are inherited solely through the mother. So every man has his mother's DNA and does not pass them on to his children. All children receive their mitochondria from their mother. So the mitochondrial Eve existed in Africa, had these three daughters, L1, L2, and L3. L1 and L2 are confined to Africa. Everyone outside of Africa are the daughters of L3, which are called M and N. And as you see, they also go to specific regions of the globe, though in a sort of different pattern from the Y chromosome. And one reason may be that the mitochondria produce the energy in the body, and it may be that as people went north into more northern latitudes, they needed particular mutations on the mitochondria set to sort of burn more energy and generate more heat. And that may be why only 4 of these lineages, A, B, C, D at the bottom and X at the top, ever made that very cold passage across the Beringian Strait from Siberia to the Americas. So all American Indians belong to one of these 5 lineages. So that branch of human migration I told you about that went from India into Europe, if you look at these dates are dates of archaeological sites, and dates of the Aryan culture, which is the culture of modern humans known in Europe. They marched steadily across Europe from east to west. All these radiocarbon people have recently changed all their dating standards. So all these dates are slightly too young. So we now think the Arab nations arrived at the Neanderthals' doorstep about 46,000 years ago and had reached Spain more like maybe as quickly as 40,000 years ago. So it took about 5,000 years maybe for the behaviorally modern humans to enter Europe and defeat, probably exterminate, without interbreeding, the Neanderthals. So we've now come to 40,000 years ago, and we're still hunter-gatherers. We still earn our living off the land. We build nothing, and we leave almost nothing behind except the very striking painted caves of Europe. And the Ice Age is winding towards its end. And life is pretty good because these warming plains of Europe and Siberia are covered with rivers of reindeer who breed in great profusion, and our hunting ancestors had a great time with this plentiful source of meat, which changed ecologically. Sometimes it was reindeers, sometimes it was deer, sometimes it was mammoth, but there was plenty of stuff to hunt, and life was good until about 20,000 years ago, when we were faced with a climatic catastrophe. Now, if Al Gore had been living then, he would have written a book called An Inconvenient Truth, The Planetary Emergence of Global Cooling, and he would have been right, because the glaciers came roaring back for one final time before the Ice Age ended. And this is what Europe looked like from about 20,000 to 15,000 years ago. Now, what I'm not sure is whether Al would have given the right advice for survival, which was essentially invade southern France. Everyone living in, you see England, for example, is completely covered by glaciers, and below the glaciers are a sort of polar desert that is uninhabitable. So everyone in the north would presumably have moved southward as the climate deteriorated. And it seems likely that these migrating northerners, with the cold front right behind them, probably would have had the edge over the southerners, because the cold was accompanying the northerners and they were adapted to it, and the southerners were not. So it seems likely that you had a great displacement of populations. So up to this time, we know the ancestral human population would have had dark skins which you needed to survive in the African sun, and we know so too did the Australian Aborigines. So it seems very likely that the first inhabitants of Europe, including the great artists who painted the Chauvet caves and other caves of Paleolithic art, probably had dark skins. But as they moved north, they would have needed to lighten their skins to admit more sunlight, which you need to create vitamin D. So when these pale-skinned northerners came southward, they presumably would have replaced their dark-skinned southerners. And the same would have happened independently in both halves of Eurasia, both in Europe and in East Asia. So in both halves of the continent, you would have had the pale-skinned people from the north replacing their dark-skinned cousins. And this dramatic worsening of the climate obviously put an enormous stress on human populations. When the glaciers retreated back to the north, two very interesting things happened in the two halves of the Eurasian continent. So in Siberia, which was a center of world action at that time, the Siberians accomplished a very significant feat. They domesticated the first animal, which was the dog. And they liked their dogs so much that they took them with them across the Bering Strait to North America, which is very surprising. So dogs are domesticated from wolves, and everyone had assumed that the American Indians had domesticated their dogs from the local wolves. But a recent examination of mitochondrial DNA of dog cemeteries in North and South America showed that all those ancient American dogs, in fact, came from East Asia. So dogs do many things in our society, but probably the most important one for early people was their role as guard dogs. Because the one thing that dogs do and wolves don't is to bark. Barking is not much use for a hunting animal, but it is of great use for warning of ambushes and impending attacks. The other remarkable thing that happened was in the Near East, and we at last started to settle down. Having spent 35,000 years wandering as hunters and gatherers, we made the first settlements. The Natufian culture, these are the known sites of the Natufian culture, first appeared about 15,000 years ago. So these settlements must have come about through a lot of things. One is that modern humans were becoming less aggressive than they were in the days of the ancestral human population. One piece of evidence for that is that the human skeletons in all continents of the world become much less robust, much less thick. They become gracile in the paleoanthropologist's term. So there's a gracilization of human skeletons which implies, though it doesn't prove, a lesser degree of aggressiveness and fighting. And that may have been what allowed people for the first time to live in fixed settlements instead of roaming about. I mean, it may seem such an obvious choice to us that you've got a roof over your head and sort of gather plexus surfaces of food. Life becomes so much more under your control and so much easier. But that's not the case if you're a sitting duck for some roving band of hunters and gatherers that comes and steals your property and your women, as used to happen a great deal. And I think that's why the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to settled societies took so long. But once it had taken place, again you had a tremendous change in the environment which people had to live in. The whole cognitive outlook of someone in a settled society is different from someone living in a settled society. There's no advantage in being smarter, or very little advantage in being smarter in a hunter-gatherer society because it's egalitarian. You cannot own property. If you kill more animals than anyone else, you have to share it all around. In a settled society with some surpluses that will be to be managed and with property, there's a bigger payoff to being a little smarter. So I think our cognitive evolution, which has been continuing all this time, also probably continued in settled societies and was changed a lot by it. I'd like to give you one quite striking example of recent human evolution in response to a cultural change. So this is the emergence of genes for lactose tolerance, the ability to digest the lactose in milk in adulthood. In most people it turns off when a child is weaned because you never see lactose again in your diet, so why presume it's sufficient to turn the gene off? But in the first cattle raising culture of Europe, called the funnel beaker culture, that lived about 5,000 years ago in northern Europe. People drank a lot of milk, and it was clearly an advantage to develop a mutation that kept the lactase gene on so you could digest lactose. So the top map shows the distribution of ancient cattle in Europe, and the highest genetic diversity, which usually is the sign of the place of origin of the species, is in northern Europe, in Holland, Denmark, southern Sweden. And then if you look at the map below, this is the frequency of the lactose tolerance gene in Europeans. And in the black outline, you see the archaeological area of the funnel beaker culture. So it seems very clear that this genetic change emerged in the funnel beaker culture as an adaptation to a cultural practice, and then spread out among northern Europeans, getting less common the further away you go from its source. So this is a very interesting mechanism. People usually think of genes and culture as being somewhat separate, but the genome, of course, is designed to allow the organism to survive in its environment, whatever that is, and for social animals, particularly for us, nothing is more important than our culture. So our genome will respond, if it can, to any long-term cultural pressure. And this is what presumably happened in the case of lactose tolerance. This is a very recent change. People used to think that human evolution sort of stopped and ground to a halt when we reach some level of perfection way back in the distant past. So most social scientists believe they don't have to worry about evolution, it all happened long ago, out of their realm. But evolution cannot stop. It's driven by mutation, and mutations happen over time, and we continue to evolve. There are lots of instances of how we have evolved in the past. Many of them coming to light right now concern the sort of different pattern of diseases found in different ethnic groups and different races, and this is another example. So I'd like to come now to the question of the differentiation of the human population into different races. This is a subject, as you know, with a sort of difficult history, and for very understandable reasons, because of the misuse of race. Geneticists have tended to play it down and say that race is no big issue. The differences between the populations are very negligible, and the social scientists have sort of taken this even a little further and said, well, race is a social construct, it does not have a biological basis. Well, all this is well-intentioned, but it's not exactly the case. There has been differentiation of the human population. It's no big deal, it's exactly what you'd expect if you take a very small species and you spread it across the globe, and it responds in different ways to different local conditions of climate and disease. And also, of course, there's this important force of genetic drift, which I mentioned in connection with the Y chromosome. So here's a recent experiment just taking measuring the genome at about 400 points from people in many population groups around the world. Each small vertical bar is a different person, and within a different population group. And within each population group, there are individual people. You can't see the people, but in the places where you see two different colours, that's one individual who has one part of his genome in sort of one race and another in another race. So what happened here is that the scientists asked their computers simply to group all this genetic data into a number of different groups, first into two groups, so you see the two colours at the top, and then into three groups, then into four. When the computer was asked to split everyone into 5 groups, it came up with this result that matches very well the human geography and seems to therefore to correspond to something real about the different races. So at K equals 5, you have Africans, East Asian, Africans, Europeans, East Asians. The green on K equals 5 are the people of Oceania and Australia, and the purple is American Indians. Now, if you tell the computer to split people into 6 groups, you see that sort of, that yellow dash in the middle. Those are the Kalash, or rather odd people in Pakistan. So that doesn't make any sense. So it just seems the natural sort of grouping are the 5 groups that the man in the street would probably say, well, these are the main human races. And you can subdivide people even further. So these are ethnicities within races. Now, all these changes are based on some common genes, and they reflect what geneticists call neutral variation. That's variation that isn't good and isn't bad for the organism. So evolution doesn't see it, doesn't care about it, so it doesn't rule these changes in or out. And most of the changes in our genome are neutral. But the changes that evolution does care about, the ones that give great advantage, these are selective changes. It's only very recently that we've been able to measure genes under selective pressure. Even our tests are not very good. Well, but when you look for a selective gene, this is the result of looking for genes under selection in the genomes of East Asians at the top, Europeans at the bottom left, and Africans at the bottom right. And you see each group has about sort of 200 genes under selection that show up in this particular test. And for the most part, they don't overlap. And that's just what you would expect, given that these populations, after we left Africa, were all evolving independently on the same continent with not much interchange of genes. Now, one thing that sort of makes, I think, rightly makes people uncomfortable about looking at the genetic basis of race is the fear that it will justify racial discrimination. I very much believe this is not the case. What is happening is that genetics is just giving us a new picture of evolution. One very important point, there are 2 very important points to stress. One is it's telling us on the one hand that only 50,000 years ago we were all descended from a tiny village-sized population of 5,000 people. So that's no comfort for anyone who wants to draw a racist a distinction between us. We're all very, very close cousins in that sense. Secondly, these selected genes, even though they come up in these tests, when you ask, well, what are these selected genes doing? In many cases, you find they are doing the same thing in different populations. And this is what geneticists call convergent evolution. So evolution is selecting genes to the same end. Now, one case we know this is true is that there are about sort of 5 or 10 genes that affect skin color. So skin color has obviously been selected because we've changed our skin since we came out of, the people who came out of Africa have changed their skin color. So this screen found 5 genes for skin color in Europeans, which would explain presumably why Europeans have their pale skin. But none of these genes came up in the selected list for East Asians. But East Asians have skin that's just as pale. So therefore, East Asians either must have acquired their pale skin very much earlier, which means they wouldn't come up in this test, or they acquired their pale skin through a different set of genes. So evolution often does this. There are 3 types of pygmy human populations in the two in Africa in widely separated points, and there's one in the Andaman Islands of the Indian Ocean. So it seems when humans live in deep forests, it's advantageous to develop pygmy size, but each of these three pygmy populations, although it's the same result, they've become smaller through different selected genes. So I think we're going to find that many of these selected genes, though they come up on this test as being not shared, they're going to, in fact, be pointing toward the same function. I'm now going to move to a completely different aspect of our evolution, which is that of language. So Darwin has an electrifying insight in The Origin of Species, in which he says, well, if you could draw up a tree of all the human races and ethnicities as populations split one from another, and if you could also draw up a tree of how languages had split one from another, these two trees should be sort of clearly parallel to each other, because when populations split, their language tends to diverge. From what we now understand about the origin of the ancestral human population, 50,000 years ago, which had just developed language and had a very small population, presumably there was a time when everyone spoke a single mother tongue. And presumably, as populations spread throughout the world and separated, the mother tongue fragmented into different language groups. So if only we could take all today's languages and run them backwards, we could perhaps reconstruct the mother tongue. Now, the trouble about this thought exercise is that linguists, almost all historical linguists, believe it cannot be done. They're very aware of how quickly language changes. The language of Chaucer's English just 700 years ago is halfway toward being a foreign language. So they say it's hopeless to try and reconstruct languages back into the distant past. There's only one linguist, almost only one, who has been brave enough to try to do this. And this is Joseph Greenberg and his colleague Merritt Rowland. These are the 14 major language families of the world that may have existed perhaps 10,000 years ago. And you can see most of, I'll just point out one of those, the Indo-European languages, most of Europe, and you see India and Pakistan have the same, and Iran as well. They all speak Indo-European languages, which presumably came from a single mother tongue that linguists know as Proto-Indo-European. And here is an even older language group called Eurasiatic. This may be about 15,000 years old. There may have been a single tongue spoken by the people who returned north after the glaciers had retreated. And if you notice, this covers England at the west and Japanese at the left, and then all the Eskimo-Inuit languages further east. So it may not be obvious, intuitively obvious, that English has a great deal in common with Japanese. And the vocabulary is totally different. There's not a single word in common except for a few accidental resemblances. But if you look at the syntax doesn't change so often. So if you knew that the Japanese understand was wakaru, and someone said to you, what does wakaru nai mean? It seems so intuitive that that nai sound is a negative, and wakaru nai indeed means I don't understand. So here at least the negative has been preserved. A common word for asking a common way of asking a question in many of these Eurasiatic languages is with a K sound. So you have qua in French, or come in Italian, or quid pro quo in Latin. We don't have this K sound in English. But if someone said to you, what does wakara mean? That ka at the end is a question. Wakara don't you understand? So here are two links in the syntax which may be very ancient and which may all spring from the time when we had a single tongue. It would be great if we had some way of dating the splits in languages. Historical linguists have played around with the way which they call glottic chronology, and half of them think it's great and half of them think it's terrible. And they have spent a lot more time criticizing it than trying to get it to work. So for a long time, no progress was made in this area until the geneticists came in. The geneticists are very used to drawing trees, and there are various methodological problems in drawing gene trees. One is that genes often go shared sideways, and the other is that different branches of the trees may evolve at different rates. Geneticists have developed very sophisticated ways for treating both of these problems, which are formally identical to the ones that occur in language. You get borrowing between two neighbouring languages, and you get languages evolving at different rates. Icelandic is almost identical to the language the Vikings spoke, but modern Norwegian is not, so you have different rates and different branches. So this is a tree that the linguists have drawn up for Indo-European, and here are all the languages spoken today, right? And the branch points are the dates that the geneticists can put on, because if you know the dates of modern events, you can plug them into your tree and work backwards to the branch points. Now, when the historical linguists saw this tree, they scoffed and said, well, it's no different from our tree. The geneticists said, well, that's the best possible confirmation you could give us that our tree has the correct shape. But what is new about our tree is the dates. So these dates are far older than the linguists ever believed languages could be reconstructed. The linguists have always said that Proto-Indo-European was spoken about 5,000 years ago. And if you ask, well, why did it spread all across Europe and the Indian subcontinent, they say, well, probably it was a band of warriors. But this much earlier date that the geneticists have come up with gives support to a quite different explanation. This is about the time when agriculture started to take off after the ice ages had ended. And it may well be that agriculture, the people who brought agricultural technology, were the way that languages spread. So it may be that under this theory, the people who first developed wheat and other crops in the Near East took that technology into Europe, even though their numbers became diluted as they moved further into Europe. The hunter-gatherers in Europe would have adopted the new farming technology, and with it, the language of those who bought it. And this would explain why Indo-European is spoken over such a broad area of the world. So they've extended their hypothesis to the rice-growing area in China, which they believe was the origin of major language groups, the Chinese, the Thai languages, and the Polynesian languages, which were spread by people leaving Taiwan. And they also believe that Afro-Asiatic, that's a language group that includes Arabic and Hebrew and ancient Egyptian, may also have been spread by another migration from the wheat-growing area of the Near East. So like everything else in linguistics, this too is very complicated. I think there's a very good chance that Indo-European spread this way. But people who study Afro-Asiatic say that its source was definitely in Africa, not in the Near East, and the Afro-Asiatic has nothing to do with an agricultural expansion. So this is just a reminder that genetics, although it reaches back into the deep past, also reaches back into human history. Historians have long disputed the rumour, even though it was printed in a newspaper at the time, that Thomas Jefferson had a family with his slave mistress, Sally Hemings. And it was only very recently when someone tested the Y chromosomes of the Carr family. That was Thomas's nephews, who his defenders said were the fathers of Sally's children, who did look extraordinarily like Jefferson. the explanation they said was the nephews were the father. But there was, if you test the Y chromosome of Thomas Jefferson's ancestors, they all have the same Y chromosome. It's different from the Y chromosome of the calf. It's identical to the Y chromosome of Eston Hemmings, one of Sally's children. So I'd just like to close with one thought, which is very unpopular with historians. It's the idea of progress. If you look, at least if you compare us with hunter-gatherer societies of 50,000 years ago, I think you could say we made progress. I don't think any of us could survive in hunter-gatherer society. We're not good enough, our eyesight is not good enough, we're not good enough hunters, our digestive process couldn't deal with all those plant foods, we'd be bored out of our minds. We're a lot better off now. But how can such progress have arisen through evolution, given that evolution is a blind and random force that has no interest whatever in human existence? And the answer I suggest is that human choice has fed back into the human genome. So you saw an example of lactose tolerance, of how culture feeds back into the genome. So it seems reasonable to me that human choice of the kind of society they wanted to live in, of whether they preferred sort of peaceful trading societies over militaristic warlike ones, although the pendulum has gone back and forth, nonetheless, over the period of years, we've become a lot more peaceful than we used to be. And I think that is in part genetically based. It's in part because our ancestors made more right choices in the past than bad ones. And we can hope we will do the same. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. I'll be very happy to take any questions if anyone has them. But I can't see the audience very easily, so maybe I should try and step forward. So no one knows for sure what happened 50,000 years ago. So if I said anything that sounded too definite and you wish to attack me, please do so. You, sir.
You said that 50,000 years ago, the original population was the size of a large village, about 5,000. And then a little while later, you talked about a group of a lucky 150 of them who split off and went to Australia. And the impression I got was that it was those 150 that then came back and repopulated Asia and Europe.
Right.
So how do we know about the are we descendants of the 5,000 or the 150?
Well, both. I mean, but all the rest of the world outside Africa is populated from that 150, which itself came from the 5,000. So.
I gather some people believe that you could take Neanderthals and put a happy code and send it to New York City and they would blend right in to us. And so that there's some debate as to how different were Homo sapien Neanderthal and Homo sapien sapien.
Well, many people have suggested that the two populations interbred, and indeed make a lot of sense because the Neanderthals were already adapted in the cold, and nothing would have been more useful to our ancestors when they first came into Europe to get a few Neanderthal genes in them and select the ones that gave you adaptation to the cold. So it's perfectly possible. However, by a great feat of scientific persistence, a geneticist called Svante Pääbo, who works at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, has managed to extract mitochondrial DNA from Neanderthal bones. So about 5 years ago, he did the mitochondrial DNA, and that proved there was no interbreeding on the mitochondrial side. It didn't exclude breeding on the nuclear side, but it just made it very, very less likely, or if it happened, it was to a very small extent. And Paber has now refined his method, and he's now trying to sequence the nuclear genome of Neanderthals with a new type of sequencing machine called the 454 machine. And he believes he can essentially reconstitute a full or pretty full Neanderthal genome. And that will give the sort of definitive answer to your question. So we don't have the final answer, but it looks pretty clear as of right now that there wasn't any interbreeding. So,
Another question is that I've always impressed by the nature shows that they show these new films of chimpanzees and how they have, you know, sort of like episodes of Survivor, they will gang up on other chimps and have these incredible, I guess, carryings off and things like that. So when you talk about egalitarian societies, I wonder, because how, for example, do we now know about genes that control chimp behavior? And how we can map that over to human behavior, because you mentioned that language.
Well, it's a very good question. Now, I think you can assume that chimp behavior is sort of governed by a set of genes, which we have not yet identified. Especially because if you look at bonobos, which are very similar to chimpanzees, they have a totally different social structure, and by a different set of bonobo genes. So it seems to me reasonable that there is also a sort of template for human social behavior, inherited like the chimpanzee one from our joint ancestor who lived 5 million years ago. And that these genes have been tweaked so they determine our social behavior, or at least, I shouldn't say determine, at least they set the framework for it, just as there are genes for the sort of set the parameters of chimp society. Now, we won't have final proof until we understand enough about the brain to figure out how neural circuits are set up, and then identify the genes that set up the neural circuits. So it's certainly far from proved, but it just seems to me a reasonable supposition. Now,
How has the National Geographic Demographic Project affected the information that you've presented tonight? Has it confirmed? Has there been any surprises? This project is